this lesson on polynomial solutions, we're going to be learning about the topics covered under the standard 2.6D and then also the topics taught in the study island lesson, polynomial solutions. As always, remember our study tips. Please be taking notes as you're going through this video. And then also, you can pause at the beginning of a question, work it out yourself, and then watch the video. And that way you can get a gauge to know how well you are learning this topic. We're going to be going over some different ways to solve polynomials, and we're going to be using some of the skills that we learned in other videos. So if you need to brush up on your factoring skills, I would watch the Algebra 1 video on factoring polynomials, and if you need to brush up on your how to solve quadratic equations skills, then I would watch the Algebra 2 video on quadratic equations. I'm so glad that you could join us today, and let's go ahead and look at some problems.
In this question here, asks to solve for a polynomial function. There are a couple of methods that you can use, but the first thing you always want to do is set it equal to 0, just like when you're solving a quadratic. So I'm going to add 25x squared to both sides, and I'm going to combine that with the 40x squared, which is the like term, on the left side. And then I'm also going to add 200x to both sides, but I don't have any like terms to combine that with on the left side, so I'm just going to write it off to the side. And so keeping it in standard order, I'm going to have 5x cubed plus 65x squared plus 200x equals 0. And so the first thing I wanted to see is if there's a greatest common factor I can remove. Well, 5, 65, and 200 all have a 5 in common, and x cubed, x squared, and x all have an x in common. So I'm going to write my greatest common factor out front, and then write a parenthesis, and then write what's left over once I factor out a 5x. So here, 5 divided by 5 is 1. And then if I have x cubed and I remove 1x, I'm left with x squared. I don't need to write the 1 in front of the x squared, but you can. And then 65 divided by 5 is 13. And then x squared, you take an x out, and you're left with an x. And then 200 divided by 5 is 40. And then you remove the x, and you don't have any left, so it's just 40, and that still equals 0. And now in the parentheses, I have a quadratic. So you could use quadratic formula here, but I'm going to go ahead and use factoring because I can see how this factors fairly easy. So that 5x stays out front, and then my x squared breaks up into x and x, and then factors of 40 that add to 13 are 8 and 5. And I need to have 2 positives there to keep the signs correct. And now I just set each of these pieces equal to 0 and solve each of these 3 equations separately to get my 3 answers. Remember, my highest power in the original problem was a 3. So that means that I can have up to 3 answers. And so here, when I solve each of those equations, I get x equals 0, x equals -8, and x equals -5, which is answer choice C. This problem here already has the question set equal to 0. And first, I'm going to look for a greatest common factor to remove, which here I can remove a 4x. So when I factor that out, I'm left with x cubed plus 16x squared minus 4x minus 64. And so now I have, this isn't a quadratic, so I don't know how to factor it right away, but I can look at factoring by grouping, which means I look at how can I factor the first two terms and how can I factor the second two terms separately. So this 4x is just going to carry through, and I'm going to look at my first two terms, x cubed and 16x squared, and they have an x squared in common. So I'm going to write that up front, and then I'm going to write a parenthesis and write what's left over. So if I start with an x cubed, I factor in an x squared, I'm left with an x. I start with 16x squared, I factor out that x squared, and I'm just left with 16. And now I'm going to do the same with the second terms. I'm going to factor out a negative 4. And when I do that, I am negative 4 divided by negative 4 is a positive 1. And I don't need to write the 1, but I need to write the x. And then a negative 64 divided by the negative 4 is a positive 16. And what's exciting here is these two parentheses match. So that means I'm in business. Life is going well. Because I can just pull out that x plus 16 that they have in common and write it in one set of parentheses. And then in my second set of parentheses, I'm going to write what's left over, the x squared minus 4. And now I can just set each of these pieces equal to 0. You could factor this one a little bit further if you wanted to. It's up to you. So if you were to factor that one a little bit further, you would have the 4x and the x plus 16 staying the same. And then here you would have x minus 2, x plus 2. And then you just set each of these equal to 0 and solve them. Here x equals 0. Here x equals negative 16. Here x equals 2. Here x equals negative 2. So I had a highest power of 4. So that means I can have up to 4 answers. And so that makes my final answer here D. Okay, here I'm going to find that greatest common factor first. And I can factor out of 4x from every term. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And then x to the 5th, I pull out an x and I'm left to x to the 4th. I don't have to write that one. 52 divided by 4 is 13. And then I had an x cubed, I pulled in an x, so I'm left with an x squared. And then 88 divided by 4 is 22. It had one x, but I pulled it out, so I don't have any left. And then I can go ahead and factor this. My x to the 4th is going to break up into x squared and x squared. And then factors of 22 that add to 13 are negative 11 and negative 2. And now, this time, I can't factor these anymore. So I'm just going to set 4x equal to 0, x squared minus 11 equal to 0, and x squared minus 2 equal to 0, and solve each of those. So here x equals 0. Here x squared equals positive 11. So I'm going to have to take the square root of both sides. And that leaves me with x over here. And then when I take the square root of both sides, my answer, I could have positive square root of 11 for x, or I could have negative square root of 11 for x and make that equation true. So when you add in a square root, you also have to add in a plus or minus. And the same thing here, this is going to be x squared equals 2. And then when I take the square root of both sides there, x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 2. And so here, I had a power of 5, so that means I can have up to 5 answers, and that's where I get my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 answers. And so that means my final answer here is going to be D. Finding the solutions from a graph is one of the easiest ways, so if you have a graphing calculator, you could use that. In the solutions, you're finding out what x equals, so you're going to look at the x-axis and where the graph touches or intercepts the x-axis. So here it intersects it at negative 5, negative 4, and 0. That's going to be my answer, and that's what's listed in letter D. This problem here only has one term with x, so we can solve using our normal solving equations procedures. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 2048 to both sides. And these cancel, and I'm left with 2048 equals 4x cubed. And you divide both sides by 4, and that gives you 512 equals x cubed. And then you just take the cubed root of both sides. Because it's an odd root, I do not add in plus or minus. You only do that for even roots. And so when I do that, I get 8. So here, x equals 8, which is letter C. Here they give us an equation for the population of a certain city, where P is the population and X is the number of years since 1970. So it wants to know what is the population in the year 2016. So the first thing you're going to have to do is figure out how many years have passed between 1970 and 2016. So when you subtract those two numbers, you get 46 years have passed. So that means x equals 46. So that I'm going to substitute 46 into this equation every place that I see an x. So when I do that, this is what it looks like. Remember, you always want to use parentheses when you're substituting in for x. So the next thing you do is you're just going to use order of operations. I'm going to do my exponents first. 46 cubed is 97,336. And then when I take 46 squared and then times that by 5, I get 10,580. Then when I take 250 times 46, I get 11,500. And then I just need to add that 3,250 at the end. And then when I do all this adding and subtracting, my population turns out to be 101,506, which is going to be my final answer, letter B. This question here is asking which of the following is the root of the polynomial f of x above. So which of these is a root means that when I plug the correct answer into this equation, I'm going to get 0. So I just have to test each one of them out. So I'm going to have to substitute for letter A to test it out. I'm going to substitute 30 in for x. So everywhere that I see an x, I'm going to substitute in the number 30. And then when you calculate that all out, you end up getting 3,240, which is not 0. So A is not your answer. So then you have to do it again with B. But this time you're using negative 11. And so anywhere that there's a that there's an x, I'm going to replace that with negative 11. And when I work that all out, I get negative 756, which is not 0, so it's not going to be B. So then I have to do it again with C. Anytime I see an x in this equation, I'm going to replace it with a negative 5, making sure to use parentheses so that I can keep track of that negative and keep my calculations correct. So when I take negative 5 cubed, that's going to give me negative 125. And then negative 5 squared is positive 25 times 4 is 100. And then 11 times negative 5 is going to be negative 55, so that changes this to a plus 55. And then a minus 30. And then when I add that all up, I get 0. And so C is going to be my answer. So in this problem here, they give you an equation and they give you 2 of the factors. And they want to know what is the third factor. So my first step is to FOIL out the 2 factors that they give us. And when I FOIL those out, I get 3, in combined like terms, I end up with 3x squared plus 5x minus 8. And so now I'm going to just take this factor here and multiply it by each of these answers here and see which one gives me the original equation. So in A, I'm going to take 3x squared plus 5x minus 8 times x minus 12. And when I factor that all out, I get, and then I combine like terms, your answer is going to be 3x squared minus 31x squared minus 68x plus 96, which is not the original equation, so it's not A. And then I'm going to have to do the same thing for the other answer choices. And so if I go down here and do it for D, I'm going to take that 3x squared plus 5x minus 8 times the x plus 12. And when I factor that all out and combine like terms, I do end up with the original equation, which is 3x cubed plus 41x squared plus 52x minus 96. And that makes my final answer D. So I skipped some of the work there so that you could see how this answer is done. But make sure that when you're working it out that you do not skip that work. And then for our final problem, I'm going to show you how to do long division. So the first thing you're going to do is, okay, well, how many times does 5x divide into 15x squared? Well, 5 goes into 15 3 times, so I write that above it. And x, I need an x squared times an x to get x cubed, so I write that above it. And now it's kind of like long division that you're used to, that you learned in 4th grade, is going to be 3x squared times 5x is 15x cubed. And then I'm going to subtract those. And so when I subtract those, I get 0. And then I bring down my next term, which is a negative 10x squared. And then you're going to repeat the process with negative 10x squared. So 5 goes into negative 10, negative 2 times, and then x times x gives you x squared. So I'm going to write a negative 2x above that. And so negative 2x times 5x is a negative 10x squared. And then I subtract those, and I end up with 0. And I bring down my last term, which is a plus 20x. And I think about what times 5x will give me 20x. Well, that'll be a positive 4, so I write a plus 4. 4 times 5x is 20x. And that subtracts to 0. I don't have any more terms to bring down, so I don't have a remainder. And so this is going to be my answer, which is choice B. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.